finite resource. On our radio program, Guyana's Oil and You, we strike at the heart of every issue with informed views and credible data. The time is now for you to arm yourself with insightful knowledge on your oil wealth. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a special edition of Guyana's Oil and You. I'm your hostess, senior journalist of Kaieteur News, Kiana Wilburg, and this evening we have with us the Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs, Mr. Anil Nandlall. Sir, thank you for making the time to be here with us this evening. And just to let you guys know, we were supposed to have the Attorney General on another program that we usually have that's aired on Tuesdays, that's 7:20, called Governance, Corruption, and Justice. But the AG also has a program of his own that he does on Tuesdays as well. But he has taken the time to be here for Guyana's Oil and You and address some of the issues that we would have been interested in asking him for our Tuesday evening show. So once again, sir, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Kiana, for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure to be on your program. I know that you have extended this invitation to me a very long time ago, and I want to apologize for my tardiness, but finally I'm here. And I want to take this opportunity also to say good evening to all your listeners right across Guyana and the Caribbean and elsewhere in the diaspora, as well as your viewers on Facebook Live.
Thank you very much, sir. So we'll dive right into our conversation this evening, and I want to start off by examining the legislative agenda of the People's Progressive Party Civic. Mr. Nandlall, many local, regional, and international stakeholders have been saying that Guyana's legislative framework, as well as its regulatory framework, is pretty much outdated for the sector and the many things that we would need. Can you outline for us, sir, what steps the government has taken to address or modernize our regulatory and legislative framework?
Well, perhaps a convenient point to begin, Kiana, is to candidly recognize that our legislative framework generally can be considered outdated, not only for the oil and gas sector, but for many sectors. And that is why, in recognition of that, and that's the most important thing, recognizing that you have a problem. And we have recognized that. And you may have read in the news that we are moving aggressively to the establishment of a Law Reform Commission.
Yes.
That Law Reform Commission is intended to be one of the driving forces that will inform our legislative agenda. In relation to the oil and gas sector, we have only been in government, as you are aware, 4 months now, and for 5 years we have been calling for the previous government to prepare Guyana for the advent of the oil industry and its growth and expansion. Our calls fell on deaf ears. Now that we are in government, we have to now, with some degree of alacrity, proceed to build not only a legislative agenda for the oil and gas sector, but indeed a legislative agenda that will enable us to use the benefits and proceeds from the oil and gas sector to develop other sectors in the economy. The oil and gas sector cannot be viewed in isolation because it's part and parcel of the economy of Guyana.
Yes.
And therefore, we have to be the proceeds and revenues that the oil and gas sector will generate will necessarily be invested in other sectors of the economy. So it would be myopic, in my respectful view, to have an oil and gas, to have a legislative agenda confined to the oil and gas sector. So, yes, we have to have one for the oil and gas sector, and if I may pause to dwell a little on that, we have to have a legislative agenda for that sector to protect the environment. We have to have one to ensure that our local policy, local content policy imperatives are underscored, protected, and advanced. We have to have one where the sector is managed in a framework and managed by technocrats and not politicians. We have to have one that have a legislative framework that caters for how oil proceeds will be recovered, how it will be saved, and how it will be invested in the future. And those are the main ones concerning the oil and gas sector. Then outside of the oil and gas sector, the oil and gas sector brings with it tremendous opportunities and new endeavors in various other sectors. So, for example, you would have observed by now that the foundation is being laid for a booming hospitality industry with several brand international hotels expressing interest in establishing a base and a presence in Guyana. We have to have a legislative landscape to prepare for that. We have to have service type sector created, and legislation governing that. We also have to have, in terms of, we are going to have an influx of apartment style townhouse developments taking place right across the length and breadth of this country. So we have to have condominium type legislation. We have to have also a relook at our zoning, our use of urban and rural lands. So we have to have proper, modern, updated zoning laws that take into account the realities of our society. We also have to have legislation that will enable us to engender a progressive agriculture agenda, because the base of our economy hopefully will remain that of agriculture. So we have to have legislation to protect our farmers, to protect food security, to regulate production on a large scale for products, in terms of products that we have never produced on those scales. We have to have legislation for the manufacturing sector, because once energy comes down, our manufacturing sector will begin to grow and hopefully boom. And that manufacturing sector brings with it a whole new vista that will require a raft of legislation that will have to regulate the way manufacturing is done in the various parts of the country. So I give you just those few examples to show how broad-based and all-embracing our legislative agenda is going to be and must be. So, understandably, it is a work in progress, and many agencies will be pushing legislative agendas which will culminate in a national legislative agenda. The oil industry, for example, as far as I'm aware, is moving in the direction of retaining its own consultants to draft legislation peculiar to that sector. I have advised the Minister of Health that we need to revamp the whole legislative architecture of our public health system. Our public health ordinance, for example, is 100 and more years old. And certainly that must be anachronistic and out of sync with today's public health realities. So we also have to get the health ministry pushing their agenda. So all the various sectors in public, in central government, will be pursuing legislative agenda to suit their peculiar agendas. And of course, that will culminate in a national legislative agenda. The Law Reform Commission, as I said, will be one of the vehicles that will be driving this agenda. So, for example, we have in the Parliament already about 6 pieces of legislation that we expect to pass before the first 2 months of this year. And we have only been in government for 4 months. So our legislative agenda is going to be vast, it's going to be penetrative and penetrating, and it's going to be all-embracing because of the mammoth amount of areas that we have to cover. So I will answer, having said all of that, I will say that the legislative agenda continues to be a work in progress, and it will continue to be a work in progress even up to next year and the next year, because a continuous exercise is going to take a number of years before we reach the type of society that we would like to reach. When you achieve a certain level legislatively, then other considerations become of some degree of prominence, and you have to move in that direction as well. So it's a fluid process, it's a dynamic process, and it's one that has begun. And I am proud to say that we have begun that process.
Thank you very much for a really comprehensive perspective there, AG. I want to zero in on a particular aspect of the legislative agenda that has received much attention, particularly by your party when it was in the political opposition, and that relates to the Petroleum Commission. There were a lot of loopholes that were pointed to where that particular bill is concerned, and it continues to languish in the Parliament. Can you say if any work at all has started where this is concerned? Has the PPP even looked at this particular area as yet?
Now, I can say to you that when Parliament would have been dissolved by President Granger in December of 2019 for preparations for the 2020 elections, the dissolution of the Parliament would have killed, so to speak,
Yes.
that bill that was in a select committee. And as you correctly pointed out, that bill suffered grave and several deficiencies, and we were very critical of it indeed. The bill is at the Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Natural Resources, and it is being actively considered by a legal department within that ministry. That department is working closely with the Chief Parliamentary Counsel attached to the Attorney General Chambers, and I know that the changes that we would like to see in the bill are being looked at right now, examined with the view of incorporating them. That is a work in progress, I know, because I have been inquiring about that. Let me jump to the local policy one, because that's the
Local
next
content,
one.
yes.
The local content one, because that's the next one that you will ask me about.
Yes.
As you are aware, you see, Kiana, these are legislation that have fundamental national importance. And a government would be acting irresponsibly rather, and would be acting with some degree of arrogance if a government decides that it will craft these legislation by itself, having regard to their fundamental importance to the national well-being of this country. As a result, some of these legislation of that caliber, we have to, as a matter of good governance, consult the country on. We have established, as you may be aware, very early when we got into government, a team that we have tasked with the responsibility of consulting with the major stakeholders in the country and to prepare a report. That team has undertaken that task and has prepared the report, and the report, I suspect, is now with the minister. That report will be used as the basis to inform policies which will be reflected in the local content legislation. Every country must have a local content legislation that meets the peculiarities and the dynamics of that particular society, because all societies are different. There is no model that you can transport broad concepts
Yes.
from across international borders, but when it comes to an issue like local content type legislation, one has to be very careful that one examines the peculiarity of the particular society at hand and prepare a legislation to meet the expectations, the challenges, and the aspirations of that society. That's why it is called local content. It's confined to the local peculiarities of that society. So that legislation also is a work in progress. The report is being examined. It will have to be considered at the level of the government, and then once the policies are agreed upon, then it will be handed to the drafts people so that it can be fleshed out into legislative language and framework.
Okay. So I'd like to turn your attention to an aspect of campaign financing. This is a topic that has been spoken of quite often during the lead up to the elections. But what we also observe is that after the elections, this subject seems to take a backseat. Sir, can you say to the citizens whether they can expect to see the PPP actually committing to having robust campaign financing legislation in place so that citizens can know for the next elections to what extent oil money has its tentacles?
I will do even better than that.
Okay.
And I will point you to the PPP's manifesto. In our manifesto, one of our manifesto promises is to enact campaign financing type legislation and other measures in Guyana. We have reached a stage in today's democratic world that these are not concepts that one can toy with any longer. The world has become too democratized. The world has become too transparent. Government and governance have become too accountable to leave these issues in a nebulous way. They must be regulated, and there must be transparency when it comes to where a political party gets its financing from. And it must be able to make that type of information public for national and international scrutiny. So, yes, the PPP is committed to that. But, Kiana, government works as a collective.
Mm-hmm.
And government, unfortunately, no matter how efficient and effective those who compose the government are or would like to be, government by its very nature is a slow machinery. Things take a long time to happen, to materialize, to be implemented, because government must act transparently and accountably and with accountability, at almost every level. That slows down governmental process. In addition to that, it is the government that must be able to respond on an hour-to-hour basis on the different things, occurrences, emergencies, national disasters that may occur on a day-to-day, or I said, on an hour-to-hour basis, distracting you from longer terms objectives. And then you have, as I said, the nature of government is a bureaucratic process that is time consuming. Every dollar that you spend, you have to go through a process, and necessarily so, because you have to have a paper trail. Projects of a certain value, you have to go through a long process of procurement, public advertisement, evaluation of contracts, award of contracts. Cabinet has to play a role. These things, these machineries are manned by human beings. The human beings work only so many hours per day, and so many things have to be done. I say that not as an excuse, but as an explanation to account for the sloth or the apparent sloth that persons may perceive hampering a government. I have a lot of things that I would want to get done. I have my desk, I am waiting to do so much more, but I have to wait until that which I have put out there is processed, because the same institution that I'm feeding this information to, I have to wait until they complete what I've given them before I can move again. It sometimes becomes very frustrating. Persons, for example, are now becoming critical. They are not seeing, for example, the case with the persons charged in relation to the criminal offense at GCOM, Lowenfield and others. They are becoming impatient because they're not seeing anything going on in the trial. Now, you have to understand, and people have to understand, that we manage and govern this country in accordance with the laws and the Constitution. I can't speak for other governments. I can speak for our government. And therefore, we don't control the police force. We do not dictate to the police force. All we can do is to make a report and activate a process. That process, for the purpose of criminal investigation, prosecution, is manned by independent agencies of the Constitution and statutory bodies. So the police force is not a department of government. Robeson Ben, as the Minister of Home Affairs, cannot direct the day-to-day operations of the force. That the force is under the superintendence of a commissioner, and a commissioner that has a management hierarchy. We can't interfere with the police and direct them how to investigate. When the matter reaches now from the police to the DPP, that's another institutional, independent institution, insulated from any form of political influence by government or any other source in the society. That office must also function independently. We can't tell the DPP what to do or to accelerate a process. We can make public calls like everyone else. We can be critical that the process is taking long. And then from there, it goes to the court if the DPP decides that charges are going to be filed. And the court, again, is another constitutional independent link in the chain over which we have no control. So the cases are there. Same thing with all the other, the land thing that we have spoken about, the corruption which we have exposed. The matter is that with the police. Persons are writing me on Facebook. They are criticizing the government in the social media that this one is walking free, yet he received $200 million in his bank account and we are doing nothing about it. It's not that we are doing nothing about it. The investigative arm of the state is investigating. And indeed, some of these investigations, they take time by their very nature. fraud is a very complex criminal offense, and to build a case of fraud against anyone is a tedious exercise. Compare that with what used to happen when we were in the opposition. The Attorney General used to pick up the phone and instruct Soku, go and arrest so and so. Ramjatan used to do the same. That is why I was able to reveal to the public that Basil Williams, contrary to his constitutional parameters, had a band of special prosecutors retained by the AG office. The Attorney General office has nothing to do with the prosecution of criminal offenses under the Constitution.
Mr. Nandlall, as much as I would love for you to continue the extensive or comprehensive points that you're making, I'd just like to go back to the crux of the matter that we're addressing here, which is campaign financing. And you mentioned in the opening statement for your response that this is something that's mentioned in the PPP's manifesto. And many media operatives are aware that manifestos, they're full of promises. Many of them are not necessarily achieved. But what you've explained, the picture you've sort of presented, is that the government machinery is not as efficient as it ought to be. And that's just one aspect of it.
It's not that it is not, no, I didn't say it is not as efficient as it ought to be.
But you did
I am
note
saying to you
slothfulness.
that it's the government system by its very nature. Governance is a slow process, not only in Guyana, but all over the world. And I am committing again, I am saying to you that yes, of course, manifestos contain promises that politicians have time and again may have breached. Well, keep us under scrutiny. Keep pointing to us on a regular basis that we have promised this. And after we continue to say, yes, we have promised it, you can then accuse us of lying. Because when are you going to impose or when are you going to enforce this promise? You can't just say that it's in your manifesto and that you have promised it and you will do it and you are not doing it. So we are saying to everyone, hold us accountable based upon our manifesto promise.
As a result of what you just noted there about the process of governance being a slow one, are you saying that prevents you from giving a guarantee that the campaign financing laws would be reformed before the next elections?
No, we are going to give you a guarantee. Our manifesto made promises for this 5-year period.
Okay. So campaign
will be
financing
delivered.
laws will be delivered.
Delivered before this 5-year period in accordance
Okay.
with our manifesto. It may
Okay.
happen before the end of the year, for all you know.
Okay.
It depends upon the priority of the government. If an election is not looming, that may not be a priority. Obviously, campaign financing relates to an elections. You follow what I'm saying?
I follow exactly what you're
But
saying.
it should be done in terms of it should be done in adequate time in preparation for elections.
Okay. Sir, the next issue I'd like to take you to relates to the electoral process. As many of us would know, one of the greatest checks and balances the citizens have on the abuse of resources such as oil money by politicians is the electoral system. But given the gymnastics that we've seen with the Constitution and the judiciary during the March electoral fiasco, it's clear that some sort of reform needs to take place urgently. Can you give us your take on the importance of strengthening this check and balance that the citizens have at their disposal? Especially in light of the fact that we have millions of dollars in oil revenue that's going to be coming in.
Democracy is the lifeblood of development. Any society that lacks democracy will be visited with underdevelopment, economic stagnation, social degradation. A fundamental component of democracy is free and fair elections. We saw how easily free and fair elections could have become illusory in Guyana March the 2nd and the events that ensued. During that period, the world called upon us. Guyana called upon us. And we promised that when we got into the government, we will do wide-ranging reforms at the level of the legislation to ensure that we, as far as possible, bridge the gaps, close the loopholes, strengthen the weaknesses which the miscreants exploited and nearly succeeded in stealing government. We are absolutely committed to that promise which we made. This year, work will begin very early. In fact, within the Attorney General Office, the drafting department, I have already assembled a small unit who will be acting directly under my supervision. I have already instructed that they get up all the requisite pieces of legislation that, in my humble view, should form the basis of the review. When I have that together, then I will hold consultations. And when I say I mean the People's Progressive Party. I am only the instrumentality through which they will act. The People's Progressive Party will be holding consultations, maybe public, maybe private, with other stakeholders, other political parties, the Bar Association, because they played an important role. They understand, the lawyers understand the loopholes. And work will be done to correct those loopholes. And these are not constitutional changes we are speaking about. These are simple things like the statements of poll must be used as the basis for tabulation of the results. And that must be made absolutely clear, so that one can't substitute a spreadsheet, as Mingo did, a spreadsheet that he concocted or was concocted and given to him with falsified numbers. The spreadsheet must be used, the actual spreadsheet. Secondly, statements of polls must be put online by GCOM and by all the political parties by law within 24 hours of receiving them. And consequences must flow when they refuse to do so if they have it in their possession. Additional biometrics, if possible, will be introduced into the law. We have to clarify and clear up once and for all whether, if you have a cyclical registration system, you can stop that system midway and start a house-to-house registration system. Then that report that the CEO is required to produce by law, we have to clarify what that report must contain. And we must have to make the language clear so that no CEO can reasonably or unreasonably prepare a report of his own. We must state in the law that invalidity of votes can only be determined at an elections petition. And no CEO or political party can determine a ballot is invalid and a ballot is not valid, outside of what a valid ballot, what is a spoiled and a not spoiled ballot. There are very little or few offenses that are in our law which speak to the electoral officials. The laws in its current form make offenses in relation to the conduct of the elector. So if you attempt to vote twice, you commit an offense. If you attempt to impersonate another person, you commit an offense. But there is not a reciprocal list of offenses in relation to election officers. And what we find in Guyana is that the election officers are the errant ones, not the electors. So we have to create a series of offenses to imprison for life election officials who attempt to compromise and the electoral machinery and process at any stage. And the higher the office the official holds, the greater the penalty to be imposed upon him. So, Kiana, that is a fundamental cornerstone of our agenda in government. We know, because of our track record, because of our performance, because of our competence, and I'm not boasting, we will not lose a free and fair election in Guyana. So it is in our interest to protect this democracy. And we know that other political parties, because of their track record, because of their incompetence, because of their corruption, they can only win by fraud. So we have to strengthen out the system to ensure that the fraud does not succeed.
And beyond the shadow of a doubt, that will happen before the next elections.
That is happening now as we are speaking.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, sir. Now, before we continue to a few other matters, I'd like to go to a quick commercial break because we would have discussed a mouthful here. So we'll give our listeners just a breather, and then we'll return to wrap up tonight's program. Guyana is now a full-fledged oil-producing nation. But how much do you know about this valuable yet finite resource? On our radio program, Guyana's Oil and You, we strike at the heart of every issue with informed views and credible data. The time is now for you to arm yourself with insightful knowledge on your oil wealth. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If you're now joining us, this is a special edition of Guyana's Oil and You. Joining me this evening for tonight's discussion is the Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs, Mr. Anil Nandlall. Sir, before we ventured on our short commercial break, we would have discussed some matters pertinent to the oil and gas sector, particularly as it relates to the legislative agenda of the PPP for the oil and gas sector. And we would have discussed the importance of campaign financing, as well as improving and strengthening the electoral process, which is one of the mechanisms that's available to the citizenry to ensure that it keeps a check on abuses by our politicians. So we'll move on to the final aspect of our program this evening, which touches on governance issues. And in this regard, I'd like to turn your attention to the Auditor General's 2019 report, where he would have flagged, for example, the expenditure of over 170 million by your predecessor, Mr. Basil Williams, on approximately 70 contracts to more than a dozen lawyers between 2015 and 2020. And I believe during an interview today, Mr. Williams would have told a section of the media that the government at the time had the right to use a portion of this money to defend the interest of the state. Sir, how would you respond to such comments, especially when the Auditor General would have pointed out that these contracts were actually given out on a sole sourced basis?
Well, let me begin with the Auditor General report generally.
Sure.
I cannot recall any given year over the past 25 years where an Auditor General report has been as damaging and devastating as the 2019 report of the Auditor General is. I have never seen such level of corruption exposed in a singular report. Almost every sector screams out, jumps out at you. Every sector has a series of illegalities, unlawfulness, squandermania, unaccountability, lack of transparency, unauthorized spending, unregistered contracts that did not go to the procurement, did not go through the procurement process, overpayment to contractors. Whatever could have gone wrong in a government went wrong and is captured in that report. I will keep that report for posterity, this particular report. I've never seen anything like that yet. So that's the first thing I want to say about the report generally.
Okay.
And then I come to the AG office.
Yes.
The Auditor General first pointed out that the AG office was reasonably fully staffed.
Yes.
It has a Solicitor General, a Deputy Solicitor General, an Assistant Solicitor General, another Assistant Solicitor General, and about 6 or 7 counsel. You know how many lawyers you're talking about there? Check them. High-paying lawyers, some of them. And notwithstanding that, this Attorney General spent over $170 million paying external counsel. I am saying to you, Kiana, tonight, that he has broken every record in this country when it comes to an Attorney General paying for legal fees to lawyers outside of the chambers. And it is not, as you said, for the year 2020. I have already said in the press
Yes.
that the 2020 invoices cannot be found.
No, this was from 2015
To
to 2019.
Yes. All right? What you read that 170 is for 2019. That is a 2019 auditor report. 99 million alone for 2019, sorry. But before, from 2016, it was a total of 170.
170.
99 million 1 year with a full staff. The laws of this country requires you to go through a process outlined in the Procurement Act if you are going to spend public funds in excess of $10 million. By law, you have to go through that process. He never went through that process, and he tells the reporter that he sees nothing wrong with that. And he is the Attorney General of the country, violating the Procurement Act, and he sees nothing wrong with that. Then he says another thing, that he was entitled to use the money.
Yes, to defend, the government at the time had a right to defend itself, and that the outsourcing of cases is actually a normal practice in the region.
Outsourcing of cases in accordance with law will be the normal practice in the region. Not outsourcing of cases in violation of the procurement law. How that can be a normal thing? And this man is the Attorney General, was the Attorney General. That is why his own party pasture him. How can you justify paying over 20 something million dollars to two senior counsel to appear for a farmer in New Amsterdam named Compton Reed, for the farmer to sue you, the Attorney General, to challenge a no confidence motion? Two senior counsel appeared for a farmer named Compton Reed in Berbice, who filed a challenge against a no confidence motion, and the Attorney General pay those two senior counsel, and the respondent, the defendant who is sued by the Compton Reed, is the Attorney General himself. So not only did he defend the government, he paid people also to sue him. How can that be legal and proper? And that man is the Attorney General. So, but that issue about the fees is symptomatic of what occurred in every other sector. You see, that is my sector, so I can speak about it at some length. But if you go and ask Bishop Edghill, he will tell you about a gentleman who one day was bored in his office at the Harbour Bridge and saw a lot of money from the toll in a box, and he head down to King's Jewelry and bought himself a bracelet. And there is somebody else who will tell you a story like that. There are multiple examples of madness, I call it madness, that permeated the last administration, as is reflected in that Auditor General report.
But Mr. Nandlall, you spoke about this example being symptomatic of the madness. I would like to write on that very statement that you said there. Another thing that is symptomatic of the situation that we find ourselves in Guyana is that there are so many reports. The Auditor General report is annual, and we see numerous cases pointing to grand corruption. Investigations are they start, but then they head nowhere.
I am glad.
No one is held accountable for these matters.
I am glad that you raised that. And let me say that it is a grave omission of mine when I was outlining the legislative agenda to have omitted corrupt type legislation or anti-corruption legislation, which we will be working on. The Procurement Act, for example, really does not create offenses when it is violated. That we have to change, to create offenses when there is a violation of the Procurement Act. And we will do it, though we are in government, so that it can be used against us. And that is how we operate in government. We passed that Procurement Act in 2000. Prior to that, there was no Procurement Act legislation. Ministers and governments were handing out contracts without any form or fashion, under any system. We established an independent procurement board and moved the whole process away from government. We did that. We resuscitated the audit office. Remember, during the PNC, there was no Auditor General. Nobody, these reports that you see coming out, even when we were in government and they were critical of us, we put that in place. Under the PNC, it was never there. So we will continue to put these mechanisms in place. What did they put in place, for example? They put SARA, which turned out to be a white elephant that we had to scrap. because they never implemented in the right way. They used the wrong law. They never appointed Clive Thomas properly. They court throughout all their cases. That is the level of incompetence and the bouts of madness that I'm speaking about.
I understand you clearly, Minister, but what I'm asking is, are we definitely, apart from the legislation that you spoke about, one of the issues that many of our local stakeholders speak to is the fact that many of our institutions that are responsible for implementing the very legislation that we're talking about, because there are cases where matters could have been successful, but as a result of the weaknesses of the very institutions, they don't get anywhere.
There is no doubt that we have to build back capacity, in this country. As you said in your advertisement, we are now a full oil producing country. That comes with it a grand array of responsibilities and duties, which we have to prepare for. We are not no unknown third world country anymore, and we have to build this capacity. Where will we get the human resource? We will have to answer that at another, perhaps at a, we have to talk about that, because we don't have it currently in Guyana. But we have, definitely we have to boost the investigative capacity of our investigative institutions and investigating institutions, all of them. The Auditor General, the Police Force, the KANU, the SOKU, and then all the oversight areas in our country. We have to build capacity. So it's a process that we have to embark upon. And we are, once we continue to work towards it, and we are dedicated, and we know what we want, and the objectives are clear, we will reach there. And you will work with us, and you will see as the changes evolve. You yourself will be speaking about them on this program. You will be saying, last year I had the Attorney General here, and he say this and this will happen, and I am proud to say that I am here and I have seen it happen.
Okay, so I
and
think
hopefully you compliment me.
So I see we still have a little bit of time that I can just put in another quick question here, sir, in relation to governance and the matters that we're speaking on. A number of investigations would have been initiated against individuals such as Mr. James Bond, Colvin Heath London, for land matters. Could you give us an update on where these issues are?
In one of my answers to questions that you had posed to me before, I had explained that the matters are with the police. Mm-hmm. And I was explaining to you that by law we can't instruct or direct the police on how to carry out their investigations. We may inquire for an update. We may be critical of them for the sloth, but they have conduct of it. It is with them, and I know that the investigation is active, and I know that the DPP and the police legal advisor and so on are working on several files, not only in relation to James Bond, but several other files. But as I said, I know that the process is a slow one, but I cannot do nothing more about it at this stage except to say that it is with the police and the investigations are ongoing.
Okay. Thank you very much, sir. We would have covered a number of issues. We tried to combine two shows here this evening, Guyana's Oil and You and Governance, Corruption and Justice. And we do hope that we can have you back again sometime in the future, sir, to speak on matters that are very important to this nation, matters that our citizens would want to hear from our leaders. So once again, sir, thank you very much for being on the program.
Thank you very much, Kiana. It was a pleasure to be with you over the past hour or so, if that's how long we were here.
Yes.
And I enjoyed our lively discourse, and I hope that I can accept your invitation on the next occasion that it is made. Thank you very much, and good evening to your viewers and listeners wherever they are.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone, and do enjoy the rest of your night.